This year's Super Bowl halftime show was headlined by Puerto Rican rapper and global music star Bad Bunny, marking the first time that a male Latino solo artist took the lead on the Super Bowl stage. His performance, much of it in Spanish, featured a vibrant mix of songs, choreography, and cultural imagery, with guest appearances from artists like Lady Gaga and Ricky Martin, with scenes inspired by Puerto Rican life and broader Latino American culture. But before Bad Bunny even stepped off the stage at the Super Bowl halftime show, the story around his performance had already become a political battleground. On the right, President Donald Trump blasted the performance both before and after the event, calling it, quote, absolutely terrible, one of the worst ever, and an affront to the greatness of America. Complaints that mostly centered on everything from the show being mostly in Spanish to it allegedly ignoring traditional American values and family-friendly entertainment. Conservative groups like Turning Point USA even staged an alternative all-American halftime show with artists such as Kid Rock and Lee Brice in protest, turning the choice of performer into a cultural flashpoint. On the other side, many liberal and progressive voices have praised Bad Bunny's performance as a vibrant celebration of Latino culture and inclusion, with some political figures like California's Governor Gavin Newsom declaring Bad Bunny Day and highlighting the show's message of unity and diversity. Others on the left critique the conservative backlash as rooted in cultural resistance to Spanish language performance or changing demographics, arguing that the controversy revealed deeper anxieties around representation in mainstream American media. The result has been a nationwide debate in which the halftime show has become less about music and more about identity, culture, and belonging, a spectacle that has drawn ire, celebration, and ideological interpretation even before the first beat of the performance dropped. The most revealing thing about the reaction to Bad Bunny's Super Bowl halftime show is obviously not about the performance itself, but the way that the backlash immediately fractured along political lines. Now, let me be clear. The Super Bowl halftime show is not a site for political resistance. It is one of the most tightly managed cultural rituals in the world, a corporate mass ceremony designed to absorb difference, smooth contradiction, and translate identity into brand value. It exists to launder power through celebration, and any analysis that starts by asking whether a halftime show challenged the system is obviously already asking the wrong question. The only meaningful question is how the system metabolized what it hosted. Liberals, however, are trained to read visibility as social rupture. When they see the Spanish language music, the flags from all across America, or a Puerto Rican artist commanding the stage without apology, they experience that as some kind of breach in the social order. Not because it actually disrupts power, but because it disrupts their expectation of how inclusion is supposed to look. For them, difference is acceptable only when framed as aspiration, as gratitude, or as progress toward assimilation. When it appears as continuity instead of arrival, it feels transgressive. That's why the performance gets misread as being revolutionary. It violates the narrative liberals are used to telling about themselves. But that obviously doesn't make it resistance. It makes it legible to a different register of power. The halftime show functions as a pressure valve for empire. It does not deny or resist domination in any meaningful way. It manages it. Multiculturalism is not the opposite of imperial power in the American context. In fact, it is one of the most effective operating systems within it. The state does not need cultural consensus to maintain control. It needs recognition without autonomy, without expression, without consequence, joy without structural change. Multicultural spectacle delivers exactly that. And this is where the confusion seems to be setting in, because when liberals celebrate the performance as anti-imperial, they mistake representation for redistribution, symbolism for antagonism, and recognition for actual material sovereignty. They see flags and languages and conclude that hierarchy has somehow been challenged. But hierarchy does not require cultural erasure to function. It requires control over material conditions, over culture, over borders, over labor, and over violence. None of those things were threatened. And at the same time, the reaction from the other side, dismissing it as pure like woke propaganda or some type of soft power, obviously is also complete nonsense. And that reading treats it all. It treats this spectacle as if it's purely ideological. It flattens it as if anything that appears within American mass culture must automatically affirm American dominance. And that assumption underestimates how unstable the platform of these spectacles have become. Overall, what made this performance interesting to me was not that it opposed the empire in any way, but that it did not fully resolve into the endorsement of either, right? It refused some of the rituals of gratitude and explanation. It did not translate itself for a dominant audience. It did not clarify its political meaning. It did not ask to be understood correctly. And the ambiguousness of this, I think, is obviously not revolutionary, but it is instructive because the empire in these moments prefers clarity. It prefers a difference that can explain itself, difference that can apologize for itself and resolve itself into loyalty. And when something appears inside one of its most sacred rituals and refuses to do that, the system can still absorb it, but only at the cost of revealing its own limits of understanding. The NFL can host Spanish language music, it can host Caribbean joy, it can even host references that gesture towards colonial histories of Hawaii, right? With the Ricky Martin song that they did. And what it cannot easily host, though, is unresolved tension without flattening it after the fact. And that flattening it is exactly what liberal commentary attempts to do with these types of events by calling the show revolutionary, ultimately just neutralize it. They turn the ambiguousness of it into affirmation of something that just isn't there. And they fold the performance back into a story where the empire is progressing, it's learning, it's becoming more inclusive, and therefore more legitimate to a progressive masses. And in that story, there are no further demands, right? No further demands are necessary. The spectacle itself becomes the victory. And this is why when you look at this in comparison to like real resistance movements, it's quite jarring, right? For some, especially those who are watching the same broadcast while observing the ongoing destruction and mass killing and genocide that is going on abroad. The disconnect is very real, right? Like multicultural celebration does not stop the bombing. It does not dismantle occupation. It does not protect people from criminal state violence, right? And for the audiences who live within the consequences of that empire directly, the spectacle, it obviously feels obscene, but obscenity and usefulness are not the same thing, right? The halftime show is not just a distraction from material struggle so much as a demonstration of how cultural management now works within the imperial core, right? The system no longer insists on uniformity. It insists on containment. It no longer needs to suppress difference outright. It needs to ensure that difference does not become autonomy and that visibility does not turn into any type of social leverage. And that's what these types of events and rituals and performances are about. And when you look at it this way, the halftime performance sits in a very uncomfortable middle position, right? It is absolutely not resistance. It is absolutely not liberation. It is nothing. It is a demonstration of how empire now consolidates itself through inclusion rather than exclusion, still leaving the cracks where belief fails to fully take hold. And the argument then is not that the halftime show should be celebrated or outright condemned. It is that it should be understood, right? Because liberals think that it's revolutionary because they confuse representation with actual power. And then critics think it's, woke propaganda because they assume that the empire that they believe that they're critiquing is always somehow incoherent and the story is always is always legible, and it's not. The truth is always very messy. Power is strong enough to host what it does not believe in, but not strong enough to make everyone believe in it. And it's that tension, that unresolved, uncomfortable tension, and that's the real story about these things, and that's the point of it.